A few words about modern India. It is the most populous country on the planet. Almost 1.5 billion people live here. Back in 2023, India's population surpassed that of China, whose population, on the contrary, is declining. That said, India boasts a population density of about 480 people per square kilometer. Compare this with 38 people per square kilometer in the US, 9 per square kilometer in Russia, and 150 per square kilometer in China. In certain parts of metropolises such as Mumbai, the figure skyrockets to over 20,000. Too awful to think about. All this leads to unemployment and poverty, obviously. It's basically a vicious circle, both a cause and an effect of those two. According to data provided by World Bank Classification, the poverty line stands at $3.65 a day. 44% of Indians are below the official poverty line, while 13% of Indians are even below the extreme poverty line, living on less than $2.15 per day. Due to poor water, especially in rural areas, tuberculosis and cholera are still common in India. Healthcare here is largely private and out of reach. Many Indian metropolises, like this one, where we record this video, have some of the highest levels of air pollution in the world. As of 2019, 21 out of 30 cities in the world with the worst air pollution black spots are in India. Nonetheless, the Indian economy is booming right now. It is among the fastest growing economies in the entire world. In terms of investments in the fintech sector, the country is only behind the USA and, surprisingly, the UK. Manufacturing is a major part of its economy, pharmaceuticals in particular. India produces a huge number of pills and other medicines. These are mostly analogs of foreign generic drugs. Then, we could go on to agriculture. Although its share has declined in recent years, India still retains its position as a major producer of rice, wheat, spices, tea, cotton, and tobacco, all of which were exported even in the days of the British Empire.
Your family is not that big by Indian standard.
Typically in my generation, now mostly it's like 2 children, you know. That's the norm. All my friends, or the previous generation, my father's generation, yes, they had more children. They had like 4, 5 children. But this generation is like mostly 2 children, husband, wife, and 2.
I was speaking of rich people, or middle class?
Oh, mostly all classes.
All classes?
All classes.
How actually serious is the rift between the rich and the poor in India? Because I've been told that there is a problem with the middle class, actually.
See, the thing is that, yes, I mean, of course, there is aspiration for the middle class or the people who are poor to, you know, go up the chain. Of course, it's universal. But vis-a-vis, you know, I've always told my Russian friends and others, you know, the reason that this country has never had a revolution, I mean, given the fact that it's more than 70% of the population is poor, or even at the time when the British left here, 90% of the population was poor. There was no middle class. So even at that time, we did not go for a communist form of government or revolution, primarily because in Indian philosophy, we have something called fate. You know, we believe a lot in destiny. So with that, people believe that, you know, this life is just one life. You'll be having a rebirth, and you know, the cycle of life will go on. So people just don't want everything in this generation. I mean, you know, people have this thing that the next life will be better. I don't know how. Yes. So you have many more options, many more. So that's why we have never had. I mean, in spite of the fact that you know, in spite of the fact that there has been so much poverty and deprivation. Not like, you know, not like Brazil. I mean, another case is like Brazil, you know. There's so much crime there. In India, you won't find that.
That's an interesting thing for me. Yeah. There are many poor suburbs as well as...
Absolutely. Affluent. No. People are generally by nature not aggressive.
Yeah. Is that because of the religion?
Because of the culture and the religion, yes.
Very interesting. Very good for you.
You walk around the British Museum now, you hear the tourists getting increasingly upset seeing their cultural heritage. What do you do about the Koh-i-Noor diamond? The Koh-i-Noor diamond, I don't know if you know, it's in the crown jewels, very big diamond, taken from, or gifted to Queen Victoria, taken from the Ranjit Singh's, the final Sikh emperor's treasury. But who do you give it back to? Because the Sikhs want it back. They don't want it to go to Modi because they don't like Modi. And then you've got the Afghans want it back because they once had it. The Iranians want it back. Pakistan probably has a claim. So who do you give it to? I mean, that's one example where actually maybe it's best to keep it in the Tower of London. At least we can see it.
Speaking of the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond, it weighs 105.5 carats and its name means Mountain of Light. It adorns one of the British royal crowns. In the 19th century, the diamond was presented to Queen Victoria by the Sikh Maharaja of Punjab when his province was invaded by the British. Now this crown and the diamond are kept here, in the treasury of the Tower of London, along with the other royal jewels. Every morning you can see a huge line of people who want to see them. The transfer of this gem was part of the terms of the Treaty of Lahore that ended the Anglo-Sikh Wars. But frankly, this whole story is quite controversial. We know that the voluntary transfer was far from actually being voluntary, at least because the Maharaja who gave it to the Queen was 10 years old at the time. It's often assumed that the boy was simply told to give the gem to that fancy lady from the painting. Moreover, according to the Treaty of Lahore, this poor 10-year-old Maharaja abdicated the throne and surrendered power not even to Britain, but to the East India Company. The diamond was delivered to London, recut and installed in the crown brooch of Queen Victoria. After her death, it was relocated several times from one crown to another, most recently placed in 1937 into the crown of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, wife of King George VI. After her death in 2002, the crown was transferred to the Royal Treasury in the Tower of London. But over time, it has become more and more dubious to display this gem. For example, at the coronation ceremony of Charles III, Queen Consort Camilla refused to be crowned using a crown with the Koh-i-Noor in it. It's easy to guess that the descendants of the Maharaja and the Indian authorities have repeatedly appealed to the royal family to return the stone. But again, as it's easy to guess, no dice. Former Prime Minister David Cameron once replied to such an appeal that the practice of returning such artifacts to other countries could lead to the British Museum winding up empty.
So now national museums in the UK, most obviously the British Museum, are subject to a series of laws that were put down, the National Heritage Act and the British Museum Act most obviously, that were invented in the 1960s and then kind of reinvented in the 1980s. And the reason that they came about in the 1960s was that in the context of the Year of Africa, when so many African nations gained independence, that moment of decolonization was understood by civil servants and museum directors in London, but also in Paris and Berlin, as a moment at which, oh my God, they're going to ask for the objects back that we took, because there was an understanding, of course, of the great symbolic and cultural significance of these items, because that was why they were taken in the first place. They had been intimately bound up with the exercise of control under colonialism. So very fast, the law was changed. So the law can be changed. The question now is whether we're going to see the law changed for the national museums.
This hall houses the Magdala collection, named after the fortress located in Abyssinia, now Ethiopia. The story went as follows. In the middle of the 19th century, Abyssinia was ruled by Tewodros II, who tried to develop relations with Queen Victoria by sending her gifts and letters. But she either never received them or was not interested in friendly relations and never answered Tewodros. He was offended and took the British consul and several other Europeans hostage to attract attention. Instead, this resulted in a major punitive expedition which completely devastated Abyssinia and killed thousands of Abyssinian soldiers. Tewodros himself committed suicide to escape the ignominy of captivity, and Magdala was looted and destroyed.
When they came, of course, they took royal crowns, numerous processional and other holy crosses, number of royal clocks, shields, several of the emperor's letters and nobles, and over 1,000 manuscripts. They even took several tablets. These are replicas of the Ark of the Covenant, which is a religious kind of artifact. Sadly, of course, most of these artifacts were sold to the soldiers as kind of like prize wins. And the city was even destroyed afterwards as a, quote, a mark of the anger of the British. I think after April 21st or so. And then most of them were taken back to Britain. So they mean quite a lot to Ethiopians and, of course, to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church.
Here are two important facts about this story. First, look at these items. These are crosses because Abyssinia was a Christian state. And secondly, for the first time in history, an employee of the British Museum participated in this expedition. He was working publicly because it was the 1860s. By an amazing coincidence, his name was Richard Holmes. And this Holmes was making sure that the best of what was looted was accessioned into the collection of the British Museum. At the same time, he was setting up auctions where he bought and sold all sorts of other artifacts. Among other things, he left us an album of his drawings. Here is one of them. It depicts the punitive British expedition. It also says here that Ethiopia is demanding its property back, and the museum is now involved in an active dialogue with them.
I believe first official request of reparations or repatriations were done in 2007 when the Ethiopian government asked for the return of these items. But unfortunately, the British law prevents libraries from returning items back to Ethiopia, namely the British Museum Act of 1963, which prohibits the British Museum from permanently disposing items in its collection. But as an attempt of reconciliation, of course, Victoria and Albert Museum, I believe in 2018, offered a long-term loan arrangement of the artifacts. This is an insult to injury to ask Ethiopians to take these items as loans. Of course, Ethiopia rightfully rejected this offer. You do not loan something that is yours.
The British Museum also has about 200 gold objects from the Kingdom of Asante, today located within Ghana. Throughout the 19th century, the British were gradually weakening and destroying this kingdom. Two of its rulers, Asantehene, were exiled to the Seychelles. It sounds a bit funny now, but back then there was no resort in the Seychelles and it was actual exile. As a result, at the end of the 19th century, the British finally annexed Asante, and it became part of the British colony of the Gold Coast. A significant part of the gold, which was really abundant there, was transported to London, in particular here to the British Museum. On January 24, 32 Asante gold items were sent to Ghana on loan. 17 items were provided by the Victoria and Albert Museum and 15 more by the British Museum. Among them are the gold peace pipe, a royal gold ring, and gold Asantehene badges. The loaned artifacts are now on display at the Manhia Palace Museum in Kumasi. This is a 3-year loan agreement, which can be extended for another 3 years. This is one of the most famous exhibits in the British Museum, a statue from Easter Island, or Rapa Nui. Interestingly, this island was never part of the British Empire, but in 1868, a British ship docked there. They saw this statue, and with no further contemplation, they loaded it onto the ship and took it to London, where they presented it to Queen Victoria. What a nice gift! In fact, it was an object of worship and a highly important religious item for the local people.
The Moai represent ancestors, and they're deified ancestors. In other words, they have gained a status of a spirit or a god as a special ancestor. And Moai, as ancestors, also protect the people who are living. So they're seen as a source that people communicate with through rituals and having the spirits of the ancestors present.
The British took several such statues from there, and it's believed that along with the statues, they took away the life force from the islands. There's your difference in perception. One of the most striking cinematic visualizations of what the British Empire was like at the beginning of the 20th century is the almost 4-hour film Lawrence of Arabia, made in 1962, which is now considered a cinematic classic that received 7 Academy Awards. It is based on the memoirs of British intelligence officer Thomas Lawrence. These memoirs are called 7 Pillars of Wisdom, a fittingly modest name. During the First World War, Lawrence infiltrated the Arab nomads in the Arabian Peninsula, for which he later received the epithet of Arabia. But along the way, he embraced the ideas of their struggle for independence from the Ottomans and became one of its leaders. However, it later turned out that the idealized civil society that he was going to build there in the Middle East was not what the locals needed. They didn't quite get there yet. And when Lawrence found out about French and British plans to divide the Middle East between them, he tried to convince the Arabs that they should create an independent Arab state instead of obeying the Europeans. However, when the army led by Lawrence captured Damascus, you can see it in this photo, it turned out that the Arabs didn't want to rule the city without British help, and they couldn't. They quarreled among themselves and municipal services stopped working. The local prince, Faisal, went to London for negotiations where he was promised the throne of the king of Syria, and he happily took it. And a disappointed Lawrence returned to Europe. This is the plot of the movie. But who was the real Lawrence of Arabia? Here is his picture. He's an ideal son and a product of the British Empire and imperial thinking. He's both a military man and a scout. He certainly promoted London's interests in the Middle East. In this sense, it's doubtful whether he really tried to raise some kind of rebellion against British interests, or if this was just a romanticized interpretation for the movie. The latter is surely more likely. In the process of forming the empire, as we remember, they largely relied on brute force and the army. In India, they relied on the force of the East India Company. But soft power was no less important. 150 years ago, soft power meant behind-the-scenes intrigue at courts, behind-the-scenes diplomacy, all these talks in cigar rooms over a glass of whiskey, in the smoke of expensive tobacco. That's how all global issues were resolved back then. And it was always London's strong suit. This smoke, it was always good at bringing local rulers to its side.
Yeah, T. Lawrence was a writer, a novelist, but during the First World War, he was a kind of a mediator between the British Empire and Arab kingdoms in the Middle East, in Arabia, who wanted to resist Ottoman rule, the Ottoman Empire's rule. Many in Britain had no intention of fulfilling the promises Lawrence was making, even as he was making them. So he was very disillusioned. He felt that Britain had betrayed Arabs. And then after the Second World War, even before the Second World War, with Britain backing Zionist Jewish settlement in what's now Israel, Lawrence felt that this was a further betrayal of the promises that he had made to Arab people in the Middle East. The problem was that Britain had promised Palestine twice, once to Arabs, as Lawrence himself had done, but also to Jews trying to escape oppression, pogroms, murder in Europe, to Zionists. After the Second World War, Britain found itself in a predicament in Palestine that it wanted to get out of as quickly as possible.
Before World War I, the territory of modern Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, and it was a predominantly Arab region with a small Jewish population. But in 1917, after the First World War, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and control of the Palestinian lands was transferred to London. This is called the British Mandate. London announced that it would establish a Jewish national homeland in the region. The Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, this is him, wrote a letter about this to the head of the British Jewish community, Walter Rothschild. Here he is. This document, this letter, is known as the Balfour Declaration. There it is. It says that Great Britain is supportive of Zionist aspirations and the struggle of Jews to return to their historical lands. London really started to facilitate the move of Jews here. They began coming to the region en masse. Their influx especially increased with the Nazis coming to power in Germany. We all know what was happening in Germany at that time. This, in turn, caused a stir among the Arabs. In 1936, they started a full-scale revolt against the increasing Jewish population and British control. In 1939, Britain published a so-called White Paper. Here it is, the White Paper, or Statement of Policy. It stipulates that the government and His Majesty aims to establish an independent Palestinian state within 10 years. And the number of Jewish immigrants over the next 5 years should not exceed 75,000 people. And after 5 years, they may be banned from entering altogether if the Arabs object to their immigration. Of course, the process only intensified after the Second World War and the Holocaust. Armed clashes began again, and now Zionist militant groups attacked British facilities. In 1947, the UN proposed dividing Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, making Jerusalem a common international zone. Now, looking back, we can say that it was a totally utopian plan. At that moment, the Jews accepted it, the Arabs rejected it, and Britain simply abandoned its mandate and left Palestine, leaving those who remain there to sort out all these problems themselves. And they are still doing it. The rest is history. In May 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel was proclaimed. The Soviet Union and Stalin supported this idea because it seemed to Stalin that he could use this as a way to bring socialism to the region, but he was mistaken. At the same time, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan began the first Arab-Israeli war, which is known in Israel as the War of Independence.
You know, there were certain contexts like India in 1947, like Palestine in 1948, where the British just wanted to cut and run. That didn't mean they wanted to give up on the empire just yet. They still wanted to be a major global power. They wanted a seat in the Security Council of the UN. So one aspect of that was becoming a nuclear power, doing all that Britain could to be a nuclear power, which would guarantee it a seat on the Security Council alongside the Soviet Union and the USA. So it did its weapons testing in colonial sites in Australia and then in Christmas Island in the Pacific. The other aspect of that was maintaining some remnants of its former imperial dominance. So where it felt there was a possibility of clinging on to power, it did. So they fought in Kenya to put down the Mau Mau insurgency. They fought in Aden in the Middle East, in what's now Yemen. They fought in Malaya, putting down a communist insurgency. Suez was absolutely vital for British geostrategic interests, given the control of the canal and the shipping routes to the east.
The isthmus separating the Red Sea from the Mediterranean Sea became a transport corridor back in the Middle Ages. Venetian and Arab merchants here loaded goods from ships onto overland caravans, which took the shortest route to the next sea where ships were waiting for them. Of course, it was long, expensive, and unsafe. The idea of connecting the two seas with a canal originated in Paris during the time of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. And it makes sense because this route would be 8,000 kilometers shorter, as it is now, compared to circumnavigating Africa by sea. The French also saw certain military benefits here. They could use the canal to transfer their fleet to India, but the project, of course, turned out to be too complicated. According to preliminary estimates, the Red Sea's level was almost 10 meters higher than the Mediterranean, necessitating the development of a gateway system. Napoleon was defeated by the Allies before this project was fully developed, and the idea of building the canal was postponed for 40 years. In the 1850s, French diplomat Ferdinand de Lesseps obtained consent from the Egyptian authorities and registered the Suez Canal Joint Stock Company in Paris. 44% of the shares were bought by the Egyptian government and 53% by the French government. Tens of thousands of workers were involved in the construction of the canal at any given time. It was the project of the century in every sense. Mostly, of course, the workers were Egyptian. According to official data at that time, about 1,000 people died during the construction. In the middle of the 20th century, Egyptian authorities were already talking about 120,000 dead. Either way, a lot of people died. In 1869, the canal was opened for ships, and here again, London's behind-the-scenes politics came into play. Only 6 years later, Ismail Pasha of Egypt, this proud man, sold the Egyptian shares to the British, and the channel officially became English and French. But in fact, Britain was its sole administrator. In July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal as a means to fund the Aswan Dam project in light of the British-American withdrawal. Of course, it meant war. Israel took the side of the British and French owners of the canal, and the USSR took the side of Egypt. Nasser had been friends with Moscow for a year by that time. Here's a photo of him with Nikita Khrushchev. The Egyptian leader was facing a very urgent issue of reforming the army. For that, he needed to buy weapons. First, he turned to the U.S., but weapons sales were conditional on Egypt entering the Baghdad Pact with Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and Turkey. Cairo did not agree to this, and instead of America, they turned to the USSR. Moscow agreed and, through Czechoslovakia, began equipping the Egyptian army without any conditions, because the Soviet Union believed that in this way they would spread socialism to the Middle East. And this time their bet actually panned out. Egypt closed the Suez Canal to Israeli ships and effectively declared a blockade of the entire Israeli coast. On the night of October 29 to 30, 1956, Israeli armed forces pushed toward the Suez Canal, defeating 4 Egyptian units along the way. And on the second day, the Israelis were joined by British and French planes. By November 6, Britain, France, and Israel reached the Suez Canal and were about to establish full control over it. In response, Moscow sent an ultimatum telegram to the UN Security Council, demanding that London, Paris, and Tel Aviv cease fire within 12 hours and withdraw their troops from Egyptian territory. Otherwise, the USSR threatened direct military support for Egypt and hinted at the use of missiles. The ultimatum worked. The UN General Assembly demanded an immediate ceasefire and sent peacekeepers to the region for the first time to resolve the conflict. Interestingly, the U.S. did not support their allies in Britain and France because Dwight Eisenhower feared that World War III could break out. He wanted to avoid an escalation, and he absolutely did not need a conflict with the Soviet Union. He categorically demanded that the Europeans stop. We remember that by that time, Europe had already effectively handed over control of its defenses to the United States and NATO, and Britain and France had no choice but to obey. This was the first time Britain had to publicly retreat under the pressure from the new Anglo-Saxon Empire, which eclipsed the old one and pushed it back.
So it thought that it could, in alliance with France and with Israel, that it could overthrow President Nasser's nationalist attempt to nationalise the canal with military force, that it could occupy the canal zone. And it was told in no uncertain terms that America's not going to back you. You're on your own, and furthermore, we want you to get out. And that was seen as a massive humiliation for many in Britain, that it now had to be obedient to the new American rising superpower. So it was a great blow to British prestige in 1956. Yeah.
This city doesn't require an elaborate introduction. Many Russians visit it. Many live there. It's a mecca for some people, a dream for others. It's Dubai. And now, when we hear about it, or when we go there, we should remember that this is also an immediate legacy of the British Empire. In the 19th century, the Persian Gulf states developed rapidly because they were located at the intersection of key trade routes. The ships of the East India Company basically monopolized trade in the region, which led to conflicts with local merchants. As a result, at the beginning of the century, London signed an agreement with several caliphates to guarantee the free use of trade routes, and in return, the Crown, as usual, promised to defend the region from external enemies. They became a British protectorate. The territory known as Trucial Oman in 1853 included the modern United Arab Emirates and, most famously, Dubai. Then, of course, there were no skyscrapers or anything remarkable in the desert. It was just a small fishing village. The Emirates' main income came from the pearl industry. But after the discovery of large oil reserves here in the 1920s, the region became much richer by the middle of the 20th century. In 1964, the League of Arab States, here is its meeting, advocated for independence from Great Britain. In 1971, London announced the termination of the treaties with the sheiks, bringing to an end the Treaty Oman. Some of these sheikdoms united into the United Arab Emirates, which we all know today. And despite the fact that Dubai is now the capital of one of these emirates, an independent state, if you have been there and researched how this city works, you know that they are always very consistent with both British law and the British economic approach. Overall, they have always followed Britain even more closely than the United States, which, of course, is also widely represented and has a huge presence there. Among other things, it's where the CIA's Middle East station is located, which is a known fact in certain circles. What caused the collapse of the British Empire?
It was the same as with others. The world was changing. It's hard to explain in a couple of words. After the end of the First World War, the Dominions were playing a bigger role within the empire. It was due to their participation in the war. They sent troops, supplied weapons, produced shells, resources, people. Take the Canadians or the famous Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. Anzac Day is a national holiday in Australia and New Zealand. At the same time, these dominions declared their agency during the First World War. Why is it that we are at war, but all the decisions are made without us?
At the beginning of the 20th century, the British Empire began to weaken. One of the most important reasons is the First World War. This centaphis is a monument to the victims of that war, many of whom were not British. In 1914, the regular British Army numbered 250,000 men. This is several times less than the million-strong armies of Russia, France, and Germany, which were replenished through conscription. But the British still had a resource that the continental countries were lacking. 4 years later, the British Army had already almost 4 million soldiers, many of which were soldiers from the colonies. This played an important role in victory for the Allies. However, by the end of the war, resentment was growing in these colonies. They were providing London with people and resources. Their citizens were dying en masse thousands of miles from home. but their countries were getting very little in return. Meanwhile, the UK was also suffering huge losses in terms of its economy. By the end of the Second World War, the kingdom's national debt reached £3.5 billion, with the US being their main creditor. During World War II in Great Britain, every third house was destroyed. More than 250,000 military personnel and 60,000 civilians died. Two-thirds of the fleet had been sunk. London no longer had the money to support many colonies. The first step in the collapse of the empire was the liberation of its dominions and protectorates, which recognized the British monarch as the head of state. These were Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the Union of South Africa, the future South Africa. In 1931, British Parliament adopted the Statute of Westminster, which granted the Dominions full independence in their internal and external affairs. In 1947, Britain, as I have already said, lost the pearl of its crown, India, and at the turn of the 50s and 60s, African countries were gaining sovereignty one after another. The British Empire lost its last colony in July 1997. That's when Hong Kong's status as a British colony officially ended. This moment is considered the symbolic end of the empire's existence. Hong Kong is a region in southeastern China with a territory of just over 1,000 square kilometers, which was ceded to the British in 1842 after the Opium War between London and Beijing. The Qing Empire was dissatisfied with the fact that Britain was selling opium to the Chinese. It banned British traders from conducting any activity in the region and confiscated opium from them. Of course, this turned into a war which was successful for London. The British began to develop Hong Kong as a strategic port for trade with China and other Asian countries. As a result of the Second Opium War in 1860, the Kowloon Peninsula and Stonecutters Island were also ceded to form part of British Hong Kong. Then in 1898, China leased most of modern Hong Kong to Great Britain for a period of 99 years. In the beginning of the 20th century, the population of this city was growing rapidly due to the influx of Chinese. They fled wars, revolutions, and poverty on the mainland. And the city developed as a center of international trade, banking, and shipping. Finally, the 100-year lease of Hong Kong was coming to an end. In 1984, Great Britain and China signed a memorandum which would transfer Hong Kong from British rule to Chinese rule. It was to take place in 1997. Here is the photo with Margaret Thatcher from the British side. The conditions for the handover of the city to Beijing were the preservation of Hong Kong's capitalist system. We remember that China is socialist, and the preservation of Hong Kong's broad autonomy within the framework of the one country, two systems principle for another 50 years until 2047. This is 1997, the handover of Hong Kong. British flags were solemnly lowered everywhere, while Chinese flags were solemnly raised. The Chinese People's Army solemnly entered the city, paraded through the streets, and went to the barracks. And it seemed like life didn't change at all. I remember it very well because I was one of the journalists covering this process. I remember we flew to Hong Kong a year after this broadcast in 1998. It was a very British place. Absolutely everyone spoke English. There were still British flags everywhere, even though it was already China. I remember it seemed strange to many journalists from Russia that the locals were so happy to return to China, because many people really were. And in Russia, it was the 90s, the time of freedom. Everyone brought up Aksionov's novel, The Island of Crimea, where, according to the plot, Crimea is not a peninsula, but an island. And after the Russian Civil War, it stayed with the White Army. Then they wanted to reunite with the mainland and negotiated the return with the communist government in Moscow, all while capitalism was flourishing in Crimea. Well, the Soviet army entered, destroyed everything, and capitalism totally perished, as well as the main character. Everyone compared it to the island of Crimea and wondered why people were so happy. But the people were happy nonetheless because they were tired of living under the British. Actually, the fears of Russian journalists at that time might have been justified, because the principle of broad autonomy lasted 20 of the planned 50 years. And it's not really holding up anymore, because by the end of the 2010s, Beijing began to tighten the screws. These photos show how in 2019 in Hong Kong, there were huge protests with thousands of people taking to the streets against a bill that allowed extradition from Hong Kong to mainland China. Later, the protesters demanded the preservation of the political freedoms promised to them earlier. Local lawyer Benny Tai even came up with the idea to hold unofficial primaries, a preliminary selection of opposition candidates for elections to the local legislative council. Beijing saw this as an attempt to overthrow the constitutional government. 50 residents of the city were charged, many were imprisoned and sentenced to real terms of up to 10 years. The Apple Daily opposition newspaper was shut down, its accounts were frozen, and the owner ended up in prison. All in all, we can say that Hong Kong passed from the rule of one empire to the rule of another empire. Well, at least geographically and historically, it is much closer to the current one.
Now we're in the second half of this 50-year period, in which China would get more control. Naturally, they're already thinking about it, trying to enforce it, and businesses take this into account. So far, they still work largely under British law, according to rules and laws that existed during British rule. But people understand that it's coming to an end and they need to adapt. You can't have these two systems coexist in their full form. It's impossible.
After the death of Elizabeth II, you predicted the Commonwealth would weaken or even collapse. Why?
Because it was Elizabeth II's personal project in many ways, and it was mostly based on her authority. And in the last years of her reign, many said that the Commonwealth would undergo some changes, one way or another. Some tensions could be sensed already back then, and some countries tried to withdraw from the Commonwealth, or at least change their form of government so as not to have a British monarch as their head of state. And they were successful. There are examples of that in Caribbean countries and some others.
The Commonwealth of Nations is the direct heir of the British Empire. Its headquarters is located here in a mansion. No, in a palace. Marlborough House in London, 300 meters away from Buckingham Palace. The Commonwealth in its current state was formed in 1949 when the British Empire was already crumbling. Now it unites 56 countries with a total population of 2.5 billion. The flags of these 50-plus states are flying along the fence. Technically, the resident of Buckingham Palace, the British monarch, is the head of the Commonwealth. But de facto, he doesn't have any power over the member states.
I think that given the new geopolitical situation, Brexit, also the rise of China, that the Commonwealth has taken on new significance. It was dying. For the last 6-7 years, it wasn't seen as really important. We couldn't even get funding for the Commonwealth Games, the athletics competition, because nobody wanted to have it. But I think the new geopolitical order makes it much more important. Why? Because Britain has to find new markets for its goods, new trading arrangements, and it can turn to the Commonwealth because of this shared colonial history. There's still some redemption necessary to clean up the history, but it does have this English-speaking Commonwealth that it can rely on and it can turn to as a trading bloc and as a political bloc. That's necessary because of Brexit, because of weakening relationships with Europe, although they might get stronger now in light of what's happening with the American withdrawal from Europe. So it's become important in that sense.
Oh, the Commonwealth, has from day one struggled for a meaning. What is it? I mean, you could say it's a collection of countries that used to be part of the British Empire. But that's not true anymore, because you've got countries like Rwanda, which were never part of the British Empire, who are members. You could say, it's countries where we all share the same head of state, the king. That's not true anymore either. I mean, lots of them don't have the king. Lots of them want to get rid of the king. So it struggles for a meaning, and this has always been the case. When Nehru famously was discussing joining the Commonwealth for India in the 1950s, he sold it to his colleagues, his ministers, by saying, look, we should join it because it means nothing anyway. So that's the problem with the Commonwealth. Ultimately, it doesn't mean much. It puts on these games, and now no one even wants to put the games on. So it really struggles for a meaning, but I think it could have a meaning. I think it could be a great prism through which we talk about these things. We could talk about reparations and post-colonial truth and reconciliation. The problem is you've got all these members who want to talk about it, and you've got a country in charge of it that doesn't want to talk about it.
Every 2 years, the Commonwealth countries gather at a summit which takes place in one of the member countries, and every 4 years they hold the Commonwealth Games, their own Olympics, so to say, specifically for countries colonized by the UK. At the most recent summit, which took place in the autumn of last year, African and Caribbean countries demanded reparations for the transatlantic slave trade. The conclusion was a communique, which was signed by the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. It said, "The time has come for a meaningful, truthful, and respectful conversation." Interestingly enough, the time for this conversation has come only now, because all the Commonwealth countries revered Elizabeth II very much. So they wouldn't start that conversation when she was alive, even though they already felt it was time.
Oh, the reparations subject is personal for me on two levels. Firstly, because my parents are from Jamaica, and Jamaica was formerly a British slave colony. The British shipped 3 million enslaved Africans to the West Indies. Another million were born into slavery. So I'm a descendant of enslaved people, so it's personal in that sense. And when we think of reparations, we think about it in two parts. We think of the harm that was done, the brutalization of enslaved Africans over a 250-year period, but then thinking about how we repair it. And reparations is those two components, assessing the harm and then thinking about how one repairs the damage.
No specific details about paying reparations were discussed. There can be a number of different scenarios. The only thing everyone understands is that transferring cash to, for example, Jamaica would be out of the question. No such option was discussed, frankly, because the UK does not have extra money like this. This sum was recently calculated by the University of the West Indies, assisted by UN Judge Rick Robinson. They calculated that for all the years of slavery, the UK must pay 18 trillion pounds in reparations. Obviously, it doesn't have even a fraction of that amount. In fact, the Commonwealth countries have no direct leverage to force the UK to pay. They only have symbolic leverage. For instance, Barbados changed its constitutional status in 2021, and it doesn't consider the British monarch as the de jure head of state. But Australia and Canada still recognize the British monarch. And Jamaica is also planning to reject that status.
But maybe we should use that then as leverage to say, look, this is what you need to pay back in the Caribbean. Maybe instead of looking at 18 trillion, you maybe need to cancel the debt that Caribbean countries owe to British institutions. Maybe that will come up to 50, 100, 150 billion pounds, but it's used as leverage. So there's two ways of looking at it, literally for the purists and then symbolic. I'm more on the symbolic side. I do not think Britain will pay up 18 trillion to the West Indies, but I think that they should consider key interventions to ensure that those nations and their descendants in Britain have real opportunities that have been closed to them.
So there's a clear moral case that Britain got rich partly through the exploitation of the Caribbean and African countries, and that reparations would be just in that sense to try and bridge some of that yawning gap in living standards that was created. But when you look at the practicalities, it's highly unlikely that there will be any form of reparation, particularly as Britain's gone through a cost of living crisis, along with much of the Western economy. It's been hit since 2008 by the banking crisis.
These numerous countries, the former colonies, including the members of the Commonwealth and the African Union, can't just go to the International Court of Justice individually or collectively and sue the UK. That requires the UK's consent. They can only start the process when there is an agreement between them and Britain. There is an option that can create legal pressure, an advisory opinion. In the UN, it's usually the General Assembly that issues such things. They can go to the International Court of Justice in The Hague and ask for an advisory opinion. The legal question does exist in this case.
I don't think reparations are next to impossible. Because if you look at, say, Ireland, we forget that Ireland was like the first colony, right? What has happened in Ireland? We've had the Good Friday Agreement. That involves the payment of lots of money. It involved apologies. Tony Blair, I think, apologized for the potato famine. There were apologies for various, I think, Bloody Sunday as well. I would say that was a process of reparations. And as a result of that, our relationship with Ireland is much better. I think there was a similar thing happened in Kenya. We were sued, Britain was sued by the victims of Mau Mau, and we lost that case. Britain had to pay £20 million in court. William Hague, the Foreign Secretary, had to made an apology. That was reparations. We didn't do it voluntarily. We were sued, but we did it. So clearly we have it within us. And also, I think the word reparations is toxic, and maybe we should look at it another way. We look at it in terms of investment. What is China doing in Africa? It's investing, right? That could be what Britain could be doing. Also, it's about establishing relationships. But I mean, if you ask, can Britain pay £18 trillion to the Caribbean for slavery, which is what some people want, you're right, that's not going to happen. But could Britain invest? Yeah. It could do.
Are there any recent polls showing how British public feels towards the reparations?
It's a good question. I'm just trying to think in terms of polls here. Let me think. What we do know is it's more popular amongst young people than older people. And that may be because younger people under the age of 30 have experience of what happened with Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd in 2020, were educated to understand that British imperial history isn't all good, but in comparison, we know that older people above the age of 30 to 50 who have had a more traditional British education, which was very narrow, very triumphalist, celebrating the great things that Britain did, just haven't been educated to think critically about this history and are less likely to be pro-reparations. So it depends on age to a degree.
44% of British people think the royal family should pay reparations for slavery, which is quite high, given I don't think most people understood the royal family were involved in slavery until quite recently. So I think the British public are quite interested in this history, but the politicians are very much not.
How serious is a racism problem in modern-day Britain?
There's a lot of positives in Britain. I did not think we'd have a situation in Britain where we had an Indian Prime Minister. I think it's amazing to see so many black politicians and brown politicians succeed. I think we've got a lot to be grateful for. The racial violence of the 1970s and 80s that I remember has gone to a degree. But equally, a few months ago, we had race riots, so-called race riots, on our streets in Britain. I don't know if you saw the news, you know.
Manchester, half of the areas police cannot enter. London, half of the areas police cannot enter. It's shameful on Britain that 4,000 girls between 12 and 14 years of age in Manchester, in Leeds and other places, total is more than 40,000 girls. They have been raped and pushed into prostitution. By whom? By Pakistani migrants. You can't say that you don't know it. It's all there on the internet. And Britain calls itself a civilized country. If you raise your voice as a Christian, as a white man, you are arrested and persecuted in Britain today.
How do you feel about yourself? You consider yourself more British or more Sikh?
Yeah, it's a funny one. I say I'm British Sikh. Or easier, I just say I'm a Londoner or I'm from Wolverhampton. Yeah, I don't really have a problem with that. And I feel like it's become easier and easier to be someone like me. But now you've got a situation, I don't know if you've been following the news the last few weeks, where you've got brown and Asian conservative politician saying that she is not English and that Rishi Sunak cannot claim to be English. The politics is getting more and more right-wing, where you're getting conservatives saying about their own prime minister, former prime minister, that he was never English. It's absurd. I mean, this is stuff that hasn't come up in my lifetime, but now suddenly it's being debated. And this is the way politics around the world is just getting radicalized, I think largely by Trump, you know, because America is now proudly white supremacist. And so that's encouraging politicians to say crazy stuff.
How is America, and if we can name it so, American empire is seen in modern-day Britain?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Many Britons, along with many Americans, wouldn't identify an American empire, even though there were very strong imperial tendencies which have waxed and waned in American policy. Today, I think, right now, many Britons are seeing in Trump, rather than Biden, a swing towards a much more imperial, much more aggressive attitude, reminiscent of some of the things that the British Empire used to do. You know, identifying a territory that certain British interests wanted, and then finding pretexts to annex that territory. We're seeing that in Trump's rhetoric. But there's certainly a dawning realisation right now, I think, that empire is no longer a British preserve, certainly not, and that it may well be America, as well as other global superpowers, that are becoming the new empires of the 21st century.
What exactly is known under the name of Britain's Second Empire?
Britain's Second Empire is the term we use to refer, in a sense, to what's left after the formal empire. So eventually, most of Britain's colonies gained independence, but there are a set of jurisdictions left which, for different reasons, remained part of the empire. And these are what are called the crown dependencies. Now, what these all have in common, and it's no coincidence, is that a little bit since the 1930s, but particularly since the 1950s, they've all been on this road of becoming financial centres, providing, typically with high amounts of financial secrecy, providing financial services to non-residents in ways which we can explore, but which have all sorts of damaging global impacts for the rest of the world.
Everybody knows the symbols of the former British Empire. Big Ben, Westminster, the Fleet. But this is the symbol of the modern or Second British Empire, the city. It's considered to be the control tower for a huge network of offshore tax havens, organizations where the high and the mighty, both companies and individuals, store and multiply their billions. According to the Tax Justice Network, between $21 and $32 trillion are sitting in offshore tax havens. In 1956, after the Suez Crisis, the pound sterling finally lost its status as the world's de facto currency. In an attempt to boost their failing currency, the Bank of England imposed restrictions on lending to foreigners. The banks, naturally, weren't happy about it. And then, as they say, the banks and the Bank of England agreed that in a situation where a credit institution serves as an intermediary between two non-residents for settlements in foreign currency, the Bank of England will consider the transaction to be out of its jurisdiction. How do offshore accounts work? Unlike a traditional bank where the client has an account in their name, the offshore system is based on trust funds. The asset holder, the trust founder, nominally transfers the money or real estate or shares to the trustee and thus disappears from the legal framework. The actual asset owner has no connection with their capital. They are not obliged to report it to any authorities or pay taxes. There is no unified register. There are some registers, but they are not connected to each other. Only the founder and the trustee know about the trust's existence. The crown dependencies, like the Bailiwick of Jersey or Isle of Man, belong to the British Crown, but are not formally part of the United United Kingdom. They have their own legislative and administrative bodies, as well as their own fiscal systems and courts. But their foreign policy is set by London, including offshore activities. In addition to these crown dependencies, there are also overseas territories. These are 14 islands, fragments of the empire in the Indian, Atlantic, and Pacific Oceans. Unlike crown dependencies, in the past they were all colonies, and the British monarch appoints a formal governor-general for each of these territories. His authority varies. The level of these territories' independence is also different. But what's important is that 9 of the top 10 offshore companies in the world are registered in these British territories. It is believed that 75% of the world's offshore hedge funds are registered in the Cayman Islands alone. But of course, no one knows the exact figure. But that's the most basic scheme. In fact, there are usually several firms between the owner and their money. They are called shell companies, and their function is to further mask the money's origins. For this reason, it's very hard for a journalistic investigation to find anything without the help of special services. Sometimes it's simply impossible. And very often, when they publish a major investigation, it's either the result of some kind of leak from a hacker's attack, or it is the result of the special services work.
So how much money estimated to be on offshore currently?
So there are different estimates of this, and older estimates go up to perhaps $20 to $30 trillion. That compares to a global GDP of $80 to $100 trillion depending on the period. Our most cautious estimate for the most recent data is something around 10% of global GDP, which is at the minute $9 to $10 trillion. Now, of that, we think perhaps 2/3 is not being declared to tax authorities in the countries where people are tax resident. So we're talking, let's say, some number of trillions of dollars, possibly quite a large number.
Obvious question, does London or any other capital or government have control over offshore territories?
So the UK government has played this game almost since the beginning of this process, of saying that these territories, yes, they are dependencies, but actually they have their own elected governments, and it's really not for us to interfere. They are making their own decisions about, for example, providing the kind of financial secrecy and about the damage they do. But in fact, the work that we've done at the Tax Justice Network and others like the journalist Nick Shaxson, looking into the UK archive, what you find is it's very clear. The UK government has consistently had these discussions internally. And so if you look today, while the UK government will say, all we can really do is encourage the overseas territories and the crown dependencies, in fact, in law, the UK government has the final say on any legislation. Often it won't choose to intervene, but it always can.
In a sense, politically, in terms of self-perception, does Britain remain an empire?
I think it remains a soft power empire. People who live in Britain, or even in large and small countries of the Commonwealth, still feel some kind of cultural, maybe civilizational unity. Take a simple example, the English language. People perceive it as a kind of unifying essence, which is very important. For people, language is one of the main tools for interacting with the world. And when it naturally unites you, of course, people build a whole universe in their conscience that guides their actions. So it's not some kind of rigid single system. Instead, it's being united by shared civilization and culture. And beyond just the language, it's reflected in some common traditions, cuisine, sports, music, and so on.
The UK certainly influences the rest of the world through the Beatles, football, James Bond, and Sherlock Holmes. But its soft power doesn't end there for sure. In our recent episode about soft power, we talked about how the former empire subtly steers or even leads political processes in Central Asian countries, promoting their own narrative. For example, they might be opposing Russian interests through trainings, internships, conferences, and financing of certain institutions and organizations.
Now the British Council, the Institute of Soft Power, finds itself deep in debt. The government is not going to bail it out yet. And the British Council, which has offices in 100 countries, is going to close in 40 of them. The English language means culture and influence, albeit subtly. Cameron took a trip to the countries of Central Asia last spring for a reason. It was the first time this has ever happened. He went to Mongolia and the former Soviet republics and promised to allocate $50 million specifically for the spreading of the English language there. What does it mean? It means pushing out Russian. You know that Russian language schools are being closed. In Armenia, for example, there are 2 or 3 such schools maximum. They'll open schools teaching in English. It all goes back to the Great Game, to the 19th century.
The 19th century.
Yes, because Britain was afraid that Russia would try to take away its pearl, India, through the countries of Central Asia, through Afghanistan. If there were no resources there, why would Britain be so afraid? And they say Britain is so kind. It built them roads, gave them education. Britain is just doing charity work, right? And for some reason, it fears that Russia will knock it out of the region. Britain is also a maritime power. Why would Britain need the Black Sea or Crimea? Because whoever controls the Black Sea also has influence over the Mediterranean. And there we have the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal accounts for 12% of global trade. So the sea routes should be kept under their control.
But as we know, Britain lost the Suez Canal.
Oh well. They should bear their grief with dignity.
Does British colonialism still exist today, in a sense? Maybe in the mindsets or something like that. Or it's dead?
I think it's like 90% dead. I mean, still we have certain, certain segment which is that right, left of center, more towards British kind of, intellectual socialism, but not really, no.
If I can just add to this, if you talk about my generation and people around me, the concept of like being under somebody or the British being over you, like, like having a power over you, that's completely gone. Like, I mean, I don't even think that's even a thought in our heads any longer. So it's not that, like Britain's a high power or like the colonialism, it's completely gone in my generation, at least, for sure.
So no one is seeing British as some way superior?
No way.
Not at all.
Well, I mean, I think that they try to exert their influence where they can. There's still delusions of grandeur, okay? But frankly speaking, I don't think anyone pays much attention to Britain, frankly. Of course, there are imperceptible ways in which the British influence remained, right? So we can take your question in a different direction. The legal systems in many of these colonies were British. The institutions of state, the parliamentary system was British. So the fact that English became the lingua franca of so many people, and I think you would agree, that it is the dominant language in the world.
And here we are sitting by the Acropolis, you and us in Greek, speaking English. So that is an element of cultural imperialism. So it has, you know, the British Museum and the other museums do celebrate this cultural superiority, but no, it's not an empire anymore. It certainly doesn't have the economic resources to be an empire. It sometimes, depending on the politics, I think, wishes to reclaim some of its glorious past, but I can't see how that's going to happen anytime soon.
Is there a connection between the imperial past, the self-perception of people who've been responsible for many countries in the world, and the firm stance which modern-day Britain took as an ally of Ukraine?
I think there's a contradiction there because, you know, if you look at the countries in the world which are most nostalgic about their empires, you'd have to put Russia at the top. If you look at the surveys of former European colonizing powers, the one country more nostalgic than British for their empire are the Dutch. Dutch, tiny country, disproportionately large empire, and before the British. The British were copying the Dutch when they started their empire. The British are also nostalgic for empire, but it's a complete contradiction. Then they are enraged about Russia doing something about it. Their nostalgia. I guess the difference is we have the feeling of nostalgia, but we don't act upon it.
Britain has been part of a coalition. And I think that coalition of nations in Europe and the US who have been supporting Ukraine, I think it's got more to do with the post-Cold War scenario and keeping Russia in check. I think it has a lot to do with geopolitics within Europe at this particular point in time, although that's going to change with Trump because Trump sees China as being more of a threat than Russia at this particular point in time. But yes, there is a certain kind of irony at play in that you've got a country which has invaded other countries. Britain went to Nigeria, bombed the people, you know, and took over the land, you know, done some terrible things and not atone for them, not even apologize for them, but yet they are complaining, you know, rightfully about what Russia is doing in Ukraine. But it does smack of irony and a little bit of a contradiction in terms, to say the least.
I would say the British have quite a complex relationship with their imperial past. It's very different to, say, you know, German attitudes to the Nazi period. I mean, I'm generalizing over a huge subject, but if we hold up Germany on the whole as a country which is very kind of exemplary in terms of remorse, I think narratives in Britain are much more complex because the overall narrative around Britain, say in the 20th century, you know, in the Second World War, we were the good guys. That sense is very strong. The sense that the British played the leading role in suppressing slavery in the 19th century, which is true insofar as it goes. Those narratives, I think, are quite deep within, I guess, the British kind of mental psyche, if you like. So I would characterize it as a discordant, fractured debate without much consensus, and unfortunately, as we all know, we live in very polarized times and times without much nuance, if you like.
Friends, as usual on our channel, you draw all the conclusions yourself. It's curious how the topic of empire and empires has become relevant again. And it's quite obvious why, thanks to the second coming, I'd like to say, or the second reign of Donald Trump, who has revived the idea of the Great Game. When serious people come together at a round table and, looking at a map or a globe, divide the world into spheres of influence. They talk about zones of interest without really taking into account or neglecting completely the opinions of weak players. Those who, in the words of Donald Trump, do not have enough cards in their hands. And of course, in this sense, the British Empire is dead. It doesn't have the place that it once had in global politics. There's no arguing about it. But To paraphrase the famous quote about ruins not being caused by laboratories but starting in people's heads, I can assume that the empire also exists in people's heads. And not only in the minds of its rulers or citizens, but also in the minds of those who watch and compete with it from the outside, including people from Russia. It's a completely different situation here because the relationship between England and Russia is best described as love-hate. Because when everything is fine, like in the 90s or 2000s, it is here that rich and wealthy people most often and proudly send their children to study. That's where they keep their money and buy real estate. And when things get bad, as they are now, they see England and the British as the main antagonists. It's clear why. Because the British know how to behave and position themselves in a very subtle way when talking about things of importance. After all, since imperial times, the British have always been the best at soft power, solving tough issues with reverence, hiding their rational intentions behind a convincing facade of values, and making difficult and tough decisions with a smile, while others would resort to brute force or nasty arguments. They say, for a reason, that British intelligence very often employs people not from military academies, as in most countries, but from humanitarian universities and schools. Because philologists and philosophers can have a conversation with intellectuals on any topic with a refined smile, while at the same time holding a revolver in their pocket. Remember the James Bond films, which are also an element of British soft power. And in this sense, friends, we can say, to paraphrase another well-known expression, that the empire is dead, and long live the empire. This is Redaxia. If you like what we're doing, please support us through the links in the description, through Boosty, Patreon, and YouTube sponsorship, because only your support gives us the opportunity to keep going.